Welcome to another episode of the Time for Impact podcast. And as regular listeners, which you all are, I'm sure, will know, we try to bring something every episode that's going to be educating us and helping us on our learning journey so that we can become the best volunteerism professionals that we can be. And yes, of course, today is no exception to that. So we've invited Esther Champion along today from Myrtos Consulting, and Esther is the expert, or certainly an expert, in helping us think about how to better involve people with a history of offending, both in our volunteering, but also, I guess, in other parts of our employment and other parts of our work. Esther works with lots and lots of charities. I'm sure she'll tell us more about that as we get going. But I think it's when I talk to clients, it's often a bit of a tricky area. People aren't quite sure how to involve people, what the risks involved are, or what the language to use is, which is one I'm perpetually stumbling over as well. So hopefully Esther will help us all learn and grow on that journey as we get going. So, well, first of all, I should say my co-host, of course, Matt, is here. I sometimes forget to introduce him. Hi, Matt. How are you today?
Hi, Chris. I'm good, thank you. Looking forward to exploring this topic for sure. It's one that I think is on lots of agendas of people who are leading volunteer functions. We're always thinking about how we can make volunteering more inclusive, more accessible. I think we're always thinking about how we can realize the benefits of volunteering for everyone, how we can make volunteering a good, positive experience for everyone. So I'm looking forward to learning more on this podcast.
Brilliant. And we know at the last podcast we had a little chat about in Scotland about the figures showing that volunteering is growing, but actually when we look at people who are maybe slightly more marginalised in general from volunteering, that gap is getting wider and wider, even in volunteering is growing. So it seems like a topical subject to discuss. So anyway, enough about us waffling on. And we ought to introduce our guest, Esther. Welcome to the podcast. Maybe you'd like to just start by telling us about yourself and your organisation, and what brought you into the world of helping people with a history of offending and volunteering, indeed, for that matter.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Esther from Myrtos Consultancy. So, I set up the consultancy a couple of years ago, having worked in criminal justice for pretty much my whole career, so almost 15 years, and starting to really understand that there was a huge gap between people who had been in prison or have a criminal record being able to get work or even access voluntary work. And often that came about because of fear and lack of understanding on the side of the employer or the voluntary organisation themselves. And I started out in criminal justice as an assistant psychologist working in a local prison in Bristol. And my role there was going to be to deliver offending behaviour programs. So helping the men to understand a bit more about why they were committing the crimes, what their triggers were, what some of the protective factors were, and kind of support them to try and change their way of thinking. So a bit of light touch CBT, I suppose. But due to funding, I got moved into the offender management unit, which is a department in prisons that, as it says in the tin, and I was put into a role where I was writing risk assessments on newly sentenced male prisoners, and I then qualified to be a probation service officer off the back of that, and that is where I continued my career within the prison estate. And that I really loved that. That gave me lots of experience of working with men in prison and understanding what was kind of leading them to commit crime, what was going on for them in the community, and starting to understand why people were stuck in a bit of a cycle of coming in and out. A lot of that was often around not being able to get sustainable employment or purposeful activity to keep them occupied. From there, I actually moved abroad. I had a year out of criminal justice, was a volunteer, and I just worked for a Christian union out there, and that was an amazing experience for me to learn a different culture and adjust to living somewhere that was completely different to the UK. But on my return, I was an employment consultant, and again started to really see the struggle people who had a criminal record were having in finding work. And it wasn't that they weren't suitable, it's just if they ticked that box saying they had a criminal record, they didn't hear from the employer again. So that was a real barrier for them. And then I went back into probation, and then I eventually started working for a charity that I worked for 9 years that supports people with criminal records through long-term mentoring support, and it's volunteers who do the mentoring. So I've worked with lots of volunteers, trained volunteers, and worked with lots of people who've got criminal records who really want to change their lives. Often the main things that will help them change their lives are accommodation, employment, and support. Um, and then more recently, I've actually started a job as well, alongside the consultancy, working for the Ministry of Justice. So it's all very criminal justice based. That's all I really know. So with the consultancy, what I do is I run workshops for businesses and for voluntary organisations, covering lots of aspects of criminal justice, from do you need to do a DBS check, to what might someone's conditions be when they come out of prison, to how do you risk assess and make sure that this person is going to be safe. How are they going, your volunteers that are already there going to be safe working with this person? How can you make the environment inclusive and welcoming? And kind of lots of little topics. But I also work on a consultancy basis. So if people want policies updating, or they've got their recruitment kind of adverts and they just think, oh, maybe it can be tweaked so that we're actually getting people with criminal records to apply, then I do that, offer that service as well.
Great. There must be loads of benefits for the organisation of involving people with a history of offending. Clearly loads of benefits, I hope, for the individuals themselves, but also for fellow volunteers. Do you want to sort of unpack some of that for us?
Yeah, sure. So I
Yeah.
think if we start with the benefits for the individual who's got a criminal record, I always think about what do I get through having a job, or what did I get when I was a volunteer? And I think it's there's lots of different things, but I think if we focus more on the volunteer side of things, obviously you volunteer for free, so there's not a financial benefit there, but you do get to have a reason to get out of bed. You have a sense of purpose. You feel like you're contributing in a positive way to society, or a group in society, or in some way. You hopefully get to be in a positive community that make you feel welcomed and loved, and you have a sense of belonging. You might have an opportunity to develop and grow your skills, and depending on obviously what life stage people are at, that might be to help them gain employment down the line, or it might be because they're just like, I'm retired but I still want to learn, or it's an opportunity for you to give back and use the skills that you've already got to enable others to grow in their skills. So those are obviously just a few examples of some of the benefits of volunteering that we can have. And then if you think about someone that's been in prison who has been separated from community, who probably their self-esteem is pretty low and they don't have a lot of confidence, they don't think they have a lot of worth, they probably often don't think that they can really do very much. I've worked with a lot of men and women who are just like, yeah, I'm a bit stupid, I don't have any skills. Yet what they're really saying is, I didn't do well at school because the school environment didn't work for me, and I was told that I wasn't capable of anything. So if we kind of then think of someone who's been in prison going and getting a voluntary opportunity, it gives them a sense of purpose, because they might be waking up in the community, they suddenly don't have a routine anymore. So it gives them that routine. It puts them in a position with people who maybe have lived very different lives. And actually, again, they can learn, both can learn from each other. The other volunteers are aware about that person having a criminal history. But equally, if they're not, it allows this person to just be a normal person in a normal group of people who are doing normal things. And there's a real acceptance there, which they may not feel in general, because again, society can be quite anti people who've got criminal records, because there's a lot of fear and the media doesn't help that. And then if you think again, people in prison, if they've been in prison a long time, they're potentially limited to the skills that they can develop. That's depending on the prisons they're in. Some prisons are fantastic for the opportunities that they have, others less so. So a lot of them are eager to learn new skills and give back actually, and a lot of them want to give back as a kind of a bit of a recompense really, to saying, I know I've done something wrong, I want to give back to kind of make amends. So lots and lots of benefits to the individual, benefits to the organisation. There's so much evidence that says that a business's or an organisation's reputation actually increases as a result of diverse recruitment, including recruiting people with criminal records. And if we think about the businesses that are very overt about what they do, so Timpson's, Cook Foods, you've got KMPG, Greggs, none of them have a bad reputation. Yet they're all very vocal about what they do. And obviously businesses actually fear the opposite. They think, oh, well, if we're open about what we're doing, we'll get a bad reputation. Yet actually it is the opposite. Often, and again, this will be different for voluntary organisations, but in terms of a social value point or a return on investment, businesses will often get more business as a result because they're seen to be doing something good and their social value. And I think from a voluntary perspective, if you as a charity, you're constantly trying to fundraise. And actually, I think that is really good for a funding application to include that inclusive recruitment, to show how that social value piece is working within the charity sector and the voluntary sector. And it just creates a different diversity of volunteer, which isn't a bad thing if we want to generalize who is generally volunteering. And that might present some challenges, but actually, if people are willing to grow and learn, those challenges can be turned into real kind of rewards, actually, and benefits. So, and then from a societal benefit, people who have been in and out of prison are keeping busy, they're doing something, they're less likely to reoffend. Like that's kind of a real simple thing. So less money is getting spent on putting people in prison because they're actively doing something. So yeah, just a few benefits.
I'd say some of that rings true with, I think I'm sort of taken back when you describe that to some of the conversations I've had over the years with sort of perhaps the more operational side of volunteering that I've been involved in lots and lots of different organizations, where, I've been involved in recruitment of people who have experience of criminal justice system, and often you're talking about the things that have now appeared on a DBS certificate, and you're looking at those things and you're trying to understand that and unpack that with an individual to hopefully make some decisions about that. And the shape for me of almost all of those conversations, almost all, not all of them, but many of them, and many of them that have worked out really well, if I'm honest, have been people saying, yeah, this stuff happened, but that's not really who I am anymore. That's not really who I want to be.
Yeah.
And this opportunity is a gateway to me being the kind of person I am and the kind of person I want to be. It's hard sometimes because you have to say, what's the organization here to do, right? So that there is a bit of that. But if I take my sort of organizational hat off and put my where does volunteering fit into society hat on, as it were, is like, what is, volunteering and the benefits of volunteers can be so powerful. Volunteering can be such a force for good if we're prepared to make the right decisions about that, helpful decisions, supportive decisions, if we're being kind and thoughtful, and it feels like there can be real benefits for everyone, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you raised a really good point there about those conversations around what might come up on a DBS. And I think there's different ways of approaching DBS checks. And I think for voluntary organisations, DBS checks cost money. And sometimes you really do need to do a DBS check. If you're working with vulnerable adults or children, you have to make sure that the volunteers are safe and that these people are not at risk. But it's also then looking at, just because something might come up in a DBS, it doesn't mean that person can't still volunteer in that arena. Because if the conviction is nothing to do with vulnerable people or children, then they could be a real positive in that space. But I think a lot of people misunderstand DBS checks, why they were brought about in the first place, and what their purpose is. And DBS checks were actually all about because judges wanted to know if there was a pattern of offending behaviour when they had someone before them in court. And so they got these in place, but they're used so widely now when they're not necessarily needed. And it feels like a rite of passage in this country to just say, oh, we'll get a DBS and then we'll see if you're suitable. And actually, there's kind of assessing risk and then taking it too far, where you're then not actually getting people in front of you who could be fantastic volunteers. So yeah,
I'd say there's also there's also a live challenge. I think sometimes I imagine we're much better at this now, but I feel like I've experienced at times, or a perception at times, of a DBS check being the risk assessment, essentially almost like the beginning and end of the risk assessment, which is we've done this, it's got this information, and it's like the risk assessment is a like yes or no gateway sort of thing. It's like you can either come in here or you can't come in here. And we all know that when it comes to people and people's lives and their experiences, it's always more complicated than that. There's always a story, there's always context behind any of that stuff. And I just think we owe it to everyone really to be better at thinking about risks and treating people as people in some instances.
Yeah, I mean, I often cover in my workshops, and I don't get people to tell me the answers, but I often start with, what's the worst thing you've ever done? And that doesn't necessarily mean that you've broken the law, because, you know, some of the worst things don't necessarily mean you're breaking the law. But it's like, okay, now imagine that you're turning up to meet a group of people who know all about what you've done, but they don't know anything else about you and you know nothing about them. Are you actually going to turn up? And if you do turn up, how are you going to feel? Like, you're going to feel judged pretty quick, even if they don't do anything to overtly make you feel judged. And that's some of the issue I have about people having to declare criminal records in advance of them being met, and DBS checks being done before a conversation has been allowed, or if a DBS check isn't even necessary, because the majority of positions out there do not require a DBS check.
In fact, majority of them aren't technically allowed to be DBS checked under the Police Act.
Yep, exactly. But again, like I said earlier, like we feel like we have a rite of passage to know. And I think, when do we draw the line of letting people who have made some terrible decisions, like all of us have, at one point in our life, but some of us just, it wasn't against the law. When do we let people just be people and move on with their lives? And unfortunately, the system that we have doesn't allow that. You know, I know people who have been out of prison for 20 years, yet some jobs still require a DBS check and they still have to relive what was going on for them at the time over 20 years ago. And you think, I don't want to relive my life, like what my life was like 20 years ago. Like, it, you know, why are we continuously asking people to relive stuff? And again, it depends on who you're volunteering for. What's the potential risk? And if it's front facing with vulnerable people, it's wise to know certain bits of information. And if there's any lone working going on, absolutely. But if you've got people who are sorting items out and there's a group of people present and there's no lone working, do you need to really know? So it's a tricky one, and I understand that people can be hesitant to, because we fear the unknown.
And surely there's a balance. I mean, you said some of it, you know, so the frequency of the offending.
Yeah.
When was it? You know, was it yesterday? Was it 10, 20 years ago? Is important. You know, the severity of the crime, the relevance of the crime to the volunteering activity, which I think you mentioned as well. And for me, and maybe it's because I'm a volunteering person, what they've done since is kind of important. You know, they could have done amazing good stuff in the local community as well, or in their own personal or professional lives. All of that is something about the sort of rounded person that they are. And I suppose I was reflecting as you're talking as well, that the perennial we have in the charity world, and I don't want to, I can phrase this carefully, because we have lots of fantastic volunteers.
We do.
Millions of fantastic volunteers, but they often come from quite privileged backgrounds. And there's nothing wrong with that. No, you can't help the background you come from. But we want to diversify our volunteering organisations, and we want to make, obviously, our volunteering experiences more inclusive. But sometimes people with lived experience of the criminal justice system are going to come with some really interesting lived experience as well, which may even push them closer to some of the people we actually serve in our charities as well on occasions. So there's a real value to the organisation, to me, by not just because we want to be inclusive, but actually the diversity of perspectives and experience that individuals can bring into the organisation, surely.
Absolutely. And I think, there's certain organisations, particularly organisations that support people in recovery from drugs or alcohol or other addictions, who actually seek volunteers who have got lived experience, because they're saying, well, you've got the understanding, you've got direct understanding of how addiction can take hold. And it might not be that the journey you went on is the exact journey that this other person needs to go on, but to be able to have a volunteer who's experienced all of that be paired with someone who is going through that, it works. And I mean, sometimes, again, you need someone that doesn't understand it, but there's a real benefit sometimes of having people who have gone through difficult stuff coming alongside other people. And I think of often of youth charities who are maybe working with disadvantaged youth or children that are, at risk of getting involved with drugs. And to have someone that has been through that and come out the other side is just the perfect fit.
Yes.
Because they can say, I've been there, this was my experience, this is how hard it's been. And they might actually be able to speak into someone's life in a way that would be far better than me trying, having not been on that journey myself. And again, it's using wisdom, it's that discernment, that wisdom, looking at all of these different factors. But what I do encourage with people is, if if you do meet people that apply to be volunteers, can you ask about criminal records after you've met them, not before? So you're not coming in with any preconceived ideas that that person is allowed to be a person, and then they can talk about it or write you a letter to read afterwards. So, so you still know, but you're giving that person an opportunity to be seen for just a person rather than anything else.
Yeah. As you can probably tell, I think I'm pretty sold on the value of this for everyone. I'm interested in your experience in terms of like what gets in the way and what we should do about it. Like what is it that we're all so worried about in your experience? Perhaps some of those things with good reason, perhaps some of those things without much foundation. And is there anything you've seen that really helps to influence or to build confidence or to put our minds at ease that perhaps we shouldn't be worrying about some of these things in the first place?
I think, barriers can be fear of the unknown. And again, I think the media doesn't help, because you never really see positive things in the media about people that have committed crimes. And the wording that is often used is like monster, criminal, thug, So the media is putting an image in our mind of what someone who's committed a crime is like. And actually, I don't think I've ever met any thugs in prison or monsters in prison. That people that have made mistakes because they've had pretty awful upbringings, or they got really drunk and did something stupid. Like, again, I got drunk, did stupid things, just didn't break the law or get caught. You know, that's more the situation. And I think that risk element of, again, are we going to be safe? And maybe more from a female perspective. I don't know the percentages of how many women versus men volunteer, but I'm assuming potentially more women volunteer than men. So are females going to be safe? That's a big concern, again, because media likes to highlight things that happen against women, and that's not a bad, I'm not saying that's a bad thing to highlight, but again, it can cause women to feel less safe than perhaps we are. Um, and I think there's an element as well of just that lack of understanding. And what I've found is, when I've worked with voluntary organisations and explained things to them, and I've said, if someone is under licence conditions, they have got a set of regulations they need to follow. You're not on your own. Like, probation is still working in the background with them, or they might even have a police officer that's linked to that person. They're still there. So actually, just that little piece of knowledge has made volunteer organisations go, oh, okay, we're not so alone in this. And again, when we've looked at, have you got some robust safeguarding policies in place? Because if you have, then you've got something to follow if anything was to happen. Or what is your recruitment policy? what are the checks that you do? You know, have you had a conversation with the wider team to see how they feel? Do you want some training for the rest of your volunteers so that they might feel a little bit more secure? Because often it's once you start to get that education, it can relieve some of those anxieties and those worries, because we start to see the realities of things, and again, sharing stories about when volunteering has gone well for someone that's come out of prison. I mean, it doesn't always work out, that's the realities, but having a volunteer who doesn't have a criminal record doesn't always work out either, does it? You know, people are people. It's not necessarily the right fit, or the role that they started doing maybe isn't the right role for them, so they need to do something different within the voluntary opportunities that are available. But yeah, generally that has seemed to calm a lot of minds and help people open up a little bit more, is that understanding piece, that recruitment policy piece, that safeguarding piece, and just knowing that they've got something to follow. And even just knowing that there's a me on the end of the phone if they need to contact me, or the end of an email, can also just alleviate some concerns. And I've had that from a voluntary organisation I worked with. I got an email a few months later after the training just asking a question about something, and I was able to answer it and just again alleviate some of those worries.
I'm a big fan of training. As Matt will know, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with policy at times. I like them because it provides some clarity and some good practice. But so often I find, unless a policy, and I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect policy, but unless the policy is really perfectly written, some individuals treat it like gospel
Yeah,
and
yeah,
follow the policy to the letter
yeah,
rather than applying a bit of a person-centric approach. And this feels like an area where, of course, you need some firm safeguarding policy and so on. You need a good policy can help you risk assess offending
yeah.
history in a positive way, but it's still open to interpretation. And I worry that it makes people get very procedural rather than take a really sort of person-centric view, as we talked before, about someone's past behaviour and activity. You say you help write these policies, so maybe you can give us some wisdom to volunteer managers who will be listening, who are probably tasked with writing this sort of stuff. How do you get that balance right?
I mean, I do help with policies. I don't particularly enjoy writing policies. They are a bit dull, aren't they? But they are beneficial. I think you raise a good point. I think they can be written in a way that doesn't allow for individualization or flexibility. And I think actually just having notes in the policy about that, of, you know, a bit of a flow chart sometimes of like, yes, here are some options you could do if they do have a criminal record. It's not an instant no, it's follow this and follow that and follow that. And being able to have certain wording, even, especially in a recruitment policy, for if you do have a criminal record, we'd still love to hear from you. Something as simple as that, that actually invites someone who might have a criminal history to at least get in touch to discuss it, or say, we won't ask you about a criminal records check until we meet you, had a chance to actually have a conversation with you. Well, great. Well, that means whilst I might need to let them know at some point, you know, it's the way you write things that mean that things don't have to be quite so fixed, because again, it's wording that you use, and it's it's allowing, or even just having something at the top of the policy that is like, whilst this is what we've written, there is an element of autonomy, of discernment to be used when applying this policy. And obviously, you're not going to go completely rogue and not use the policy, but sometimes just even having that permission at the top of a policy can make people go, oh.
Yeah. And managers are often worried about how their organisations, who are often quite risk averse, will take an issue if it goes wrong. But if the policy gives them some kind of protection,
Yeah,
that's kind of useful.
yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I'd be interested in sort of turn the conversation to a bit more of a positive one. So we focused on a lot of the barriers, and I'm sure they'll keep coming up. If we recognise the benefits of involving people with a history of offending in our organisations, then presumably we would want to be recruiting and marketing with those audiences in mind. I'm always trying to encourage people to have sort of targeted recruitment, targeted marketing, even the tone of voice that you might use the language in the documents which are publicly facing that might be out there attracting or not attracting individuals into volunteering are kind of important. So have you got some sort of tips about how organizations should market their volunteering to that audience, where they should reach them, how they should reach them, how they should talk to them? How do you make sure we remove some of the fear factor about even coming forward to consider volunteering in the first place? How do we deal with the confidence issues that you talked about earlier on, because that might stop people even applying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a good place to start is, contact the local probation office and have a chat with them and say, they often, probation offices have a place where you can put flyers. And you've got people that are on license going into the offices quite regularly, so they might, take a flyer. And again, you could speak to probation to say, would this opportunity suit anyone who's got a criminal record? And probation might be able to give a bit of insight into that, because probation's job is all around risk management. It might be that they terrify the voluntary organisation, though, and then they don't want to do it. Also, again, look up, are there other organisations in the area that are working with people with criminal records, like the charity that I worked with in Bristol? And, can you link with them and say, are you working with anyone who's looking for a voluntary opportunity, who would be safe to be managed in this area? And actually, that's how the story I'll tell in a bit, that's how that materialised. And it's also, again, connecting with the local prison. So every prison has someone called a prison employment lead, who, yes, they primarily work with employers, but again, they might be able to signpost some people to this voluntary organisation, and, as a kind of direct link. But I think it's again, if you're thinking about, where are you publishing the adverts? Are you solely relying on social media, which potentially people who've come out of prison won't have, or it won't touch their algorithms? Are you just putting flyers in cafes? People who've got criminal records, this is again very generalizing, and it's a massive generalization to say this, but they may not be going into cafes, because that might not be their vibe, or where they live. Actually, in some of the more impoverished places, they aren't cafes. They just don't exist. And especially in Bristol, there's certain areas of Bristol that there is not a cafe that you can go and sit in and have a cup of coffee. So again, it's thinking about, how are you where are you putting the flyers to reach people? How are you catching people's attention? Again, thinking about wording, it is, what is that inclusive language? Are you using words like, we welcome you and we invite you? And again, it doesn't matter if you have a criminal record, we'd still love to meet you. And so it's using wording that is saying, even if we're aware of something, we still want to meet you. We want to give you the opportunity to come in. And that kind of language can really change someone's attitude to taking the risk. Because again, if you're used to being rejected by a decision that you made however long ago, you don't want to risk being rejected time and time again, because it's painful, isn't it? It's a hard thing. And so just knowing that, oh, okay, even though I've got a criminal record, this organisation might be willing to hear me out, I might give that a shot. So I would say those things are helpful.
I'm reminded of a conversation we had on the podcast recently about how I suppose some of the principles about involving sometimes specific audiences, like we want to be targeted, but as you start to unpack some of those things as well, so yes, targeted, but there's also just this kind of, if you're really sitting down and thinking, what are the things that I should be thinking about to make my volunteering offer inclusive and welcoming to everyone, and we really mean everyone, and being really open to that, you start to approach your communications and your messaging, I think, in quite a sort of radically different way. And some of that also can be unlocked by thinking about, how can volunteering benefit people, and talking about that as well as what we need as organizations. So often we talk about what we need as organizations, right? And if you come at it from that angle, it's all about what you need. It's generally not that welcoming, and it's generally not very, for all the reasons we've discussed in this podcast so far. If you start from a what do we need, it probably isn't people with experience with the criminal justice system at the top of your list, right? If you flip that mindset to going, this is a really exciting, important opportunity that all kinds of people could gain from, everyone wins. It truly is open to everyone, at least in terms of having that initial conversation to meet and talk about whether this is the right fit. You really start to kind of really change the messaging and change the approach to that sort of thing. And you probably change the channels as well, right? You think about putting that in different places and spaces and things.
I mean, places like, just thinking, so like places like community centres are probably good places, doctors' surgeries, organisations that are supporting people in recovery. They normally have meeting places. So all of those places would be really good to market any of these opportunities. And I think, you make a really interesting point, Matt, about that, of often it is what the organisation needs rather than what they can offer. And I think, being able to market is of like, are you feeling a bit lonely? Do you want to gain some skills? Or do you feel you've got skills that you can give to us? Those kind of things. So especially for people that have been in prison or got a criminal record, because not everyone's been to prison, it's like, maybe you've got some skills that you can help us with, that we really need your help. And that speaks volumes of saying to someone who has maybe felt pretty outcast by society, we need your help. And again, so it's just changing the focus, changing the lens a little bit.
It's empowering, right? And I think, and it starts to see and think from a sort of asset-based perspective that, everyone's got inherent skills and talent to offer to things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I imagine this can be true for lots of different groups that aren't predominantly involved in volunteering, but I think it's quite easy for people who aren't volunteers to think that volunteering isn't for people like me. And we can reinforce that if we're not careful by the way we promote things, right? Yeah, they're looking for this, but that isn't me. They're not looking for people like me. They're looking for people like that, and that's, having been involved in that space, right? I think it's hard to escape that loop sometimes because I suppose, being honest, we do need, organizations involving volunteers often do need certain things. Often we don't have enough volunteers to do the things we need to do, and therefore there is a bit of, we need X, Y, and Z. But I suppose, sort of slightly more philosophically, it's not a very helpful starting point often if you genuinely are committed to bringing people who are not already involved, who haven't got a background in volunteering, who could be different in all kinds of ways from the people who already do give their time. If you keep asking for more of the same, you'll probably get more of the same. You need to change that up if you want to attract different people, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with thinking about the roles that might be available, not everyone wants to do a voluntary role where they're in front of people having conversations. Some people just want to be tucked away in an office, allowed to get on with their task and then go again. And so what roles could there be that you need help with that a volunteer could do if they're not, having access to lots of data and things like that? And because there are people that are desperately shy and so feel so judged that they do want to do something, but they just not ready for conversation. But yet, if you can get them involved in a little way of giving them a space just to do it, eventually they might start coming out of themselves, and they'll start to feel like they can communicate that they do belong a little bit more, just because they've been given a bit of space and they feel like they're actually contributing without having to be person facing. And that can have a real profound impact, actually.
Yeah, I thought it felt like earlier you were sort of on the cusp of telling us a story, and I wondered if I might invite you to, I guess, presumably share some experience of where this is worked well, or some examples of that. I think it would be, I'd love to hear more about that and more about your experience in this space.
Yeah, like I've got one big story that always comes to mind, and it's because I'd known this person who'd been in prison for a long, long time, and he was late 50s, early 60s, and he he really struggled with his mental health, like really wasn't leaving the house unless it was to see his mentor or to see his mental health worker. And that was kind of it. And I floated the idea of volunteering to him because he just was like, I want to give back. I want to do something, but I don't want to speak to people. And that was partly linked because of the crime he'd been convicted for, but and also just this severity of his mental health. The anxiety he had was through the roof, and just the thought of talking to people would make him like rock, like physically rock. And so I got in touch with a voluntary organisation that I knew and had a chat with them about everything. And they met with him, and they were absolutely fantastic, actually. Just from day one, that first meeting, there was no judgment. They were very calm with him, very relaxed, made him feel very welcome, and just accepted him for who he was and his little quirks. And what I really loved is he'd just be like, right, are we done now? Are we done now? Like, so he could just go because it was getting a bit much for him. And he started volunteering, and he just wanted to volunteer in a back room and sort stuff out, basically. And that is what he did. And he had his little patch and he would get on with it. And then after about 2 weeks, he started to talk a bit to the other volunteers and then to one of the volunteer managers. And then, like, after about a year, he went up to volunteering 2 sessions a week rather than the one. And the impact it had on him, like his confidence grew, his mental health improved drastically. You know, he was going out more regularly. He was making friends and feeling like he could just be himself because people didn't know about his past, and he was able to choose what he shared and what he didn't share. And he really thrived, actually. And you know, this organization wanted him to do a bit more stuff, and he kind of said no because it was a bit out of his comfort zone. But it was a really positive experience for him, but also for them. They, you know, crossed that line into having one person who had a criminal record. I mean, this guy had been out of prison. He's been out of prison now for like 9 years, so it's a long time he's been out of prison. But they were like, oh, we just never thought that someone who'd be in prison would be this friendly or this kind or this helpful, or and so it completely changed their perspective as well of what someone who's been in prison could be like. And they grew a bit as a team, I think, of that realization and that kind of, we really want to do this more. So I kind of give them training and work with them a bit on that. And it's something they really want to pursue fully because of seeing, again, the positive impact it had on that individual and their mental health, but also the impact it had on the team in such a positive way. And then, yeah, another guy that, again, we worked with through the charity, I didn't work with him as closely, but he has got a history in kind of drug abuse and dealing, and he is volunteering again for a recovery organisation, coming alongside people who are at the beginning of that journey of recovery and being able to support them in their recovery. And again, for him, being able to give back is really empowering for him because he, you know, it's horrific being stuck in addiction. I work with many people that have been stuck in addiction, and they don't want that. They would rather be free of it. And so for him to be proud of the journey he's gone on and where he's got to and be able to give back to someone who is where he used to be is just been really good for his confidence. He's
Yeah.
also a poet, and so he's written some poems for the charity, and like we were able to, when I worked with them, we're able to commission him to do a poem for our like 10-year celebration and things. And so all of those things, like maybe might seem small for some people, they're huge for him because it's what we've communicated is we value you and trust you enough that we want you to use your gifts to bless everyone that's going to be at this event. And just little things like that have made such a difference to, and that's just again 2 people that I know about, but you know, there are hundreds of stories out there of where
Yeah.
people have been given an opportunity and have flourished as a result.
That's really nice. And as you say, I bet there are thousands and thousands and thousands of similar people. Or better still, there could be thousands more if we, as a sector, really get our act together on this to the benefit of everybody concerned. You mentioned briefly earlier on, I think, that you know there are some charities out there specifically purposed to help people coming out of prison, people with a history of offending. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of those, if you're able to?
I can try remember them. So if you're Bristol based, the charity I work for is called 61. So it's just Bristol focused, and they work with any men and women who've got a criminal record. They don't have to be in prison. So that's through long-term mentoring support, but it's looking to support those people to make positive changes to their life and achieve goals. And often, a lot of them have goals of wanting to get into work or purposeful activities. Recommend 61. There's a lot further north. A lot of companies that specifically try and support people to find work. Again, some people are better off starting with volunteering. So the Recruitment Junction, you've got Clean Slate Solutions, Offploy, are ones that just come to mind. There's London-based ones, like Coming Home, that specifically work with women. I think they might be north, but branching into London as well. There's Working Chance that work with women who have been in the criminal justice system.
I was wondering some of the national ones, people like Clinks and where they fit
So
in, and
Clinks as
Nacro.
well. Yeah, so Nacro do a lot more policy stuff, Unlock do a lot more policy stuff. You've got Clean Sheet. So there's so many different ones. Clean Sheet International, they do support people to find work, but again, if you're a voluntary organisation and you just want to get some support or signposting, then I know they'd be really happy to see, because again, sometimes voluntary work is where people need to start from, actually, to give that confidence to get back into work or give that bit of routine. Getting back into paid employment can sometimes be too big a leap, but there is a really good directory that is run by Clink. So if you just search on Google or whatever browser you use, Clink's directory, you can then put in like the specific people group that you're looking up or the area, and it should come up with different organizations that are working with people who have kind of come out of prison or who are in recovery or
Yeah,
so that's a really great resource actually that can be used to find out what's in the local area, or again ask the local probation office. They should know what's in the area, or a local church might even know a bit about what's going on or be able to signpost. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it sounds like a task for local volunteer managers to know the local partnerships, or rather to build local partnerships with
Yeah.
um, charities directly working with people coming out of prison and so on. But also, as you say, rehabilitation and drug and alcohol abuse and all those sort of organisations as well. But also, like church and stuff. So I think it's a task for us all, people who are working in those fields, to know what's happening both locally in our community and nationally,
Yeah.
and seeing not only who's there to help, but who we can partner with, I suppose.
Yeah, I think partnering is a really, really positive thing to do. I mean, 61 partner with churches and other organisations actually to support each other with best practice. 61 is kind of best practice for mentoring support for people coming out of prison, but we partner with another organisation that maybe has best practice for really specifically working with people in recovery. So we can kind of share advice and wisdom, and then you're not on your own, which I think is again sometimes a barrier, is feeling very on your own when it comes to this kind of stuff. And actually there's a lot of organisations that want to work together, and I think that's only a good thing. We can't do everything on our own, can we? So if we work together, then we're all seeking the same outcome at the end of the day, just doing it in different.
And there will be volunteer managers who think they've done some really good work in this area, and I'd say again, share that information,
Yeah.
go along to your local AVM volunteering group or something like that, and share your experience, because volunteer managers, in my experience, are all sitting in their own organisations, often a team of one, not having the opportunity to share and to learn from each other. So don't go reinventing the wheel, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Work together on these things, and we can make life better for volunteer managers, but more importantly for those who want to get involved in volunteering.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice to give, actually. I think, if volunteer managers can reach out to each other and go to those kind of forums and support one another, then again, you've got that support from maybe someone that's gone through it, or, people can support each other as they go through that journey.
And if they want to hear from Myrtos Consultancy, and for yourself, Esther, how do they get in touch?
Can Google Myrtos Consultancy, might be the easiest thing, but it's Myrtos Consultancy .com. quite straightforward. Or if you're on LinkedIn, you can find us on LinkedIn and connect with us on any of those ways. I do a newsletter generally once a month. I have a blog on my website which I update when I can, and so that's got quite helpful information on as well. And it might be if you're a voluntary organisation and you want to feature in my newsletter, get in touch and tell me what you're doing in this space. So yeah, so those are different ways, and the email address is on the website as well. So if people want to get in contact, they can send an email or just use the contact form.
There you go. And it's a challenge to us all to share our stories. So hopefully people will do that as we go forward. So thank you for joining us, Esther. It's been lovely to talk to you. It's been great to. I suppose it's been actually quite practical advice that we've got today, but also I'm hoping it's kind of reassuring for people to say that this isn't difficult. It just needs a little bit of focus and thought and sensitivity and people-centric kind of thinking. And actually, we can redesign our volunteering opportunities to really involve people who perhaps would never even think about volunteering or would think volunteering is not for them. And I think it's a shame. It's always a shame to miss, in my view, any market of people who would want to do good in our communities.
Yeah,
so we should be reaching out. So hopefully you've inspired a few of our listeners to rethink things, to refocus and re-energize their work to see if they can get people with a history of offending into their organizations. So thank you for sharing with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I've really enjoyed our chat. It's been good to kind of dig into things a little bit and yeah, hopefully inspire some people to step out of their comfort zone a little bit.
Well, Matt, reflections. What did you think?
So I really love the conversation today on this topic. I think it's one certainly that I've had sort of a fair amount over the years of sort of operational experience in terms of having to grapple with, what has often felt at the time like quite difficult decisions around involving people with experience of the criminal justice system in volunteering. I guess after the conversation this evening, I'm sort of challenging myself. While I'm playing back some of those moments, I'm also challenging myself how I in this space can think differently about this and what I can do to make things better. I think some of the takeaways for me are the stories, right, and the experiences. Like at the bottom of all of these things, people are people, and it's easy for us as organisations that involve volunteers, particularly when things get busy, particularly when we've got lots of robust processes and systems, for people almost to be reduced to that line on their DBS certificate.
Yeah.
If we're not careful. And, behind all of that, there is context, there is a story, there is a person that will be different every single time. And sort of when I step outside of organizational context, I start to really reflect and think hard about all the conversations we've had on this podcast. Almost every single episode we do here, at some point we touch on this kind of the value of volunteering, not just to organizations, but to individuals who are volunteers and volunteering, and to society as a whole. I think sometimes we need to challenge ourselves. Yes, there are risks that need to be carefully managed about involving people and making sure that's a good experience. But there's also risks of not involving people, and volunteering can be so powerful. It can be so beneficial for individuals. It can really help in all kinds of ways. And I just think we need to think long and hard about that when we're making some of these tough decisions about giving people access to those opportunities or not, and involving people with the skills to help us make those decisions. Because I think one of the things I'm also reflecting on is probably it's felt like sometimes as a sort of leader of volunteers, you find yourself making some of those tough calls on your own, and it's not a good place to be. And there are people out there like Esther who are there who have got the expertise, who have got the experience to help you think through some of these things, which is really key. I'm also minded of importance of like inclusion. And a lot of us talk about inclusion. A lot of us talk about the importance of inclusion. But I think sort of, again, one of the things that strikes me about the conversation tonight is like inclusion really means doing things differently. It means making different decisions that are going to lead to different outcomes. And whether that's how we market things, whether that's about how we risk assess things, whether that's sort of challenging our own assumptions about what we need as an organization and who we need and the kind of skills and experience we need, and how those principles around inclusion, and they're not, yes, they can be targeted, but there's also some quite general stuff about, are we organizations that invite people? Do we invite people to our volunteering opportunities, or are we just asking for, are we asking for a certain kind of person? Is this an invitation, or is this an exclusive club that only certain people can come into? And we're all probably working pretty hard to make sure we're not exclusive, but I suspect it can feel like that sometimes, trying to volunteer.
All those things you said, but particularly that last one for me is, as it so often is when we wrap up these podcasts, is that the things that we discuss on the podcast sometimes seem quite obvious, but actually when you're a busy volunteer manager or volunteer leader dealing with the day-to-day, firefighting, doing the admin, doing the management, doing the strategy, it's sometimes hard to carve out the time to think and act with proper intent to really make things better. And inclusivity is a good area for that. Not many people, I hope, are deliberately exclusive. Most people are trying to be inclusive, but it does take time. It does mean stepping back from the risk assessment or whatever you may be dealing with, and thinking, how do we act as an organisation, conscious that everything we do potentially has consequences and can cause barriers to volunteering. And as we saw with the figures coming out of Scotland recently, positive as they were, we know that people who are in the areas where there's most deprivation, and that will sometimes include people coming out of prison and people with a history of the criminal justice system, are less likely to volunteer and less likely to feel able to volunteer. And we want them in the camp. We want them involved. So if we want that, we do need to think and act very deliberately, it feels to me, to try and do something about that. And so I'm hoping with Esther's very, very practical advice today, actually, there's lots of tips and ideas that we can all take away and build into our day-to-day practice that has to help and has to alleviate some of those problems. So thank you to Esther for joining us and sharing her wisdom, but mostly for provoking some of that thinking. So yeah, and I hope it was valuable to everybody listening. As always, please give us any comments in that you think would be useful, either on the podcast channels, or you can always contact us direct as well via our website, www.timeforimpact.co.uk. And please do tell others about the podcast, share the word. We're all about the learning here, and we want to share the learning far and wide if we possibly can, but we need your help to do that. So please do, if you like this, pass the word on. And most importantly of all, keep listening, because there are many, many, many more episodes to come. So thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Chris.
See you next time. Hello again, it's Chris Wade here. Hope you enjoyed that episode of the Time for Impact podcast. I just wanted to remind you that Time for Impact is much more than just a podcast. Are you struggling to demonstrate the impact and the value that volunteering brings to your organisation, to your funders, and to your local community? Well, we may have the answers. We provide bespoke volunteer impact workshops and our own proprietary volunteering impact scorecard online tool to help you not just identify the impact that your volunteering brings, but leverage that impact too. Furthermore, Time for Impact can help you find out how your volunteers actually value their volunteering experience with you, providing you great benchmark information that tells you what you're doing well, where you can improve, but also how you can compare with other voluntary organisations across the sector. For more information on these products and our consulting, please do get in touch via our website www.timeforimpact.co.uk. Thanks for listening.